Hello everyone, welcome to Margarita Gaming, still the worst place on the internet. Today is just me playing solo today, clearing through the more boring parts of the original Legend of Zelda. There isn't much interesting going on here, it's just a grind to add time to the game, so instead of forcing my friends to sit in with me, I'm just gonna read off some facts and trivia about the game. The original Legend of Zelda was released on 1986 and developed by legendary game developer duo Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, with music composed by Koji Kondo. The man himself is quoted as saying that he based The Legend of Zelda off his own childhood experiences of exploring the wooded areas near his own childhood home in Sonobe, now Nantan. In particular, he refers to a day where he finally gained the courage to explore a cave that he had found a couple days earlier. Coming fresh off making Super Mario Bros., they wanted to distinguish this game from Mario not only in obvious outward ways, but also conceptually. Miyamoto was responsible for determining and thinking of what was Zelda ideas and what were Mario ideas. Most strikingly, The Legend of Zelda was extremely non-linear, forcing the player to consciously think of what to do next, as there was no set path, and the player was given freedom to do just about whatever they wanted, in whatever order they wanted, skill permitting, of course. Later on, this same mentality of non-linearity would eventually make it to the side-scroller with Metroid, but that's neither here nor there. In this regard, many people consider The Legend of Zelda a pioneer in not only adventure games in general, but also a pioneer in the open world game genre, a genre which has become extremely popular in recent years. Partially due to simplicity, but probably in a larger part due to technical limitations, the whole game was planned on a grid, from the overworld map to the dungeon maps. And this was present even back in some of the earliest design aspects that you can see. For example, here are some pieces of grid paper which were drawn, which show off the early dungeon designs for the first and second quest. The Legend of Zelda was only 128 kilobytes, an extremely small amount of memory, but still nearly 3 times the size of Super Mario Bros.' minuscule 40 kilobytes. As was extremely common for games of its era, it was programmed in 6502 assembly, a low-level assembly programming language that I can confidently say is basically dead. The entirety of the code has actually been exported to the game, and the full code is here at this link. As mentioned before, the game came on 2 different mediums. The disc, which was for the Famicom Disk System, and the cartridges, most notably the golden cartridge for the Nintendo Entertainment System. The disc isn't too interesting, as it's just the ROM itself installed onto a floppy disk, and it also kept the memory of the save feature on the disc as well. But the NES cartridge had the entirety of the game on a chip. All 128 kilobytes of it was as mask ROM on the chip U1PRG, and, like many games of the day, used a battery in order to keep save data. Despite the limitations, the NES and FDS both displayed the game at the standard display of both systems, the internal aspect ratio of the console being 8:7, and then going on to display it at the NTSC standard aspect ratio of 4:3, or the PAL ratio of 5:4. Both the American and Japanese version ran the game at the standard double NTSC about 59.54 frames per second. However, it usually got up to 60. The PAL versions in Europe and other areas would only get up to about 48 to 50 frames per second. And because most games, Legend of Zelda included, didn't compensate for the difference, the NES targeted about 60 Hz, in the US and the PAL NES targeted about 50 Hz, that meant that PAL versions were basically playing the game at 80%, albeit at a better resolution. Not that resolution matters that much on an NES anyway. Like many other games of the day, the manual had a lot of effort put into it, and it had many supplementary pieces of content to add to the game. In The Legend of Zelda's manual, you'll find tips, enemy names, official artwork, and even a couple maps to help you out. Whether it's due to bad translation or just classic 80s oddness, a lot of monsters have really weird names, such as this thing being known as a like-like. These snake beings called ropes, and this Hydra creature being called a Galeok. Here's the full list and the corresponding artworks. Pretty interesting stuff. The manual also has a list of items that you can get in the game, and some of the descriptions are a little bit odd as well. It also seems that they are drawn by an entirely different artist than the enemies, as the styles are very different. The oddest deviation of the manual, it seems, is the fact that the rupees are called rubies in the manual rather than being called rupees in the game. Here's the full list of items that you can get in the game in the manual. The manual also included some maps of both the overworld and the various dungeons, which are all named here. The dungeons' names in order are the Eagle, Moon, Manji, Snake, Lizard, Dragon, Demon, Lion, and finally Ganon's Lair, Death Mountain. It also included a full strategy guide of how to get to level 1, the Eagle, in the game. A guide of which I did not follow at all. Those are the big things. The rest of the manual is pretty standard fare. However, I can't go without mentioning these little illustrations of Link on the corner of the pages that engage the happy chemicals in my brain. I made a comment in the first episode about the translators of Nintendo of the era being on opium, and there are plenty of meme-worthy cases of odd or bad translation which prove my point. One, though, can understand that Japanese, with its own complex idiosyncrasies, cultural norms, and drastically different systems, can be somewhat difficult to translate to English, a language with its own barrage of complex idiosyncrasies, cultural norms, and oddness brought about by it being a mesh of French, German, Latin, and the local Anglo-Saxon languages. It is almost inevitable that things will be lost in translation, and the suspect quality of the translation at the time basically guaranteed that in most cases. Overall, the translators actually didn't have a lot to screw up in this game, as it only features short, one-line pieces of dialogue with very basic meanings. However, there are still some interesting things to go over. First of many things, the text in the Japanese version is shifted slightly over to the right, while it's centered in the US release. I would assume that this was done in an attempt to make it look like comic text, but they lacked what it took to make a speech bubble. Another thing worth noting is that the Japanese text uses exclusively katakana, which is an odd choice. However, with how much content is packed into the game elsewhere, I wouldn't be surprised if this was also due to technical limitations. Many of the dialogue is actually relatively accurate to the Japanese version. Nintendo had their A-team, and save for the odd grammar mistake or two, there really isn't a ton there. Though the grammar mistakes can add up. For example, the swordman in English says, "Master using it, and you can have this." In Japanese, he says, "Tsukai konoseru nara korera sazukeyo." Both translations don't actually tell you how to get the sword, but it's just an example of the oddly direct translation that plagued so many games of this era. Though it always isn't one-sided. An example of a comment which is actually made marginally more useful in English, but not by much, is the Hungry Goria, or the Grumble Grumble Goria. In English, he says grumble grumble, and you need to give him the monster bait in order to get past in level 7. However, nothing about this speech indicates that's what you have to do. I suppose you could interpret it as his stomach growling. However, in Japanese, it's even more useless, as in Japanese it says butsu butsu, which does not translate into a stomach grumbling, it translates closer into him grumbling or muttering to himself. This just further proves my personal theory that this game was made entirely to sell more Nintendo powers. The rest of the translation is actually pretty faithful to the source material and only has a couple odd grammar mistakes or two here and there. Probably because there isn't a lot to screw up in a game like this. While not necessarily related to translation, I'd like to take a second to mention the version that I'm playing right here is the 2003 re-release, which was on the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition for the GameCube. The game is mostly the same, however, a lot of the odd or grammatical errors were edited and cut out for the re-release. Like any other game, The Legend of Zelda went through a development process, which included a bit of cut content. Unlike modern games where vestigial relics can be found in the guts of a game, hardly any of these exist in the production cartridge of Legend of Zelda. Only two notable relics exist. One is an unused enemy type known in the ROM as $42. It's simply just a one-headed Gleeok. You can actually find it in the game by freezing the RAM address at $0350 at $42 and then changing screens. The second is an unused string of text which translates to "For further information, check the manual." So that's all we have in terms of relics hidden within the game itself. However, we do have a lot of information on the pre-release and prototype versions that show a lot of things were changed over the course of its development. The NES cartridge prototype really isn't that interesting, as it's just a port of the Famicom Disk System version, which has a couple minor coding differences to help it adapt to the NES. The most interesting thing about it was the cartridge itself was on eBay for a while for $150,000. Covering probably one of the most iconic things in the entire franchise first, the title screen music. It's no secret that the final game's title screen music is just a slightly altered version of the overworld music. However, according to Koji Kondo, the game's composer, the title screen music was actually supposed to be a snippet of the classical music piece Bolero, as the tempo matched the opening scroll. They decided against it as copyright on the song hadn't expired, and he went on to make the iconic title theme in one night. Though I must note, this probably wasn't super difficult, as the overworld theme had already been created by this point. On the subject of early design aspects, here's an early CHR layout made by Miyamoto, showing where various sprites would be stored in the CHR data. This document was rather early in development, we can tell because a few sprites occupy an 8x8 tile rather than the final game's 8x16, as well as a couple sprites which never made it into the game, like this cockroach enemy, half a sandwich, an unused tunic, these clocks, and this ox thing. Thanks to a couple Famimaga issues, specifically issues 7 and 8, we have a couple pretty interesting looks at the pre-release beta of the game. This scan in particular is from issue 7, and shows a few odd things about the pre-release. First of many things, it uses a thicker font, which would eventually actually get used in the Famicom and NES versions, but not the Famicom Disk System version. The bomb counter is also missing, despite the player clearly having bombs, and the Ta character looks slightly different from the original version. Of course, the most striking difference is the fact that the game doesn't call it the Triforce, but instead the Power Triangle. Here in this scan, which is also from issue 7, we finally get a look at Link. The terrain's a little bit different in this area of the map, as in the final version the bushes were cleared out, making it less of a choke point. If we look at Link, his sprite seems mostly the same, but peculiarly he has a couple extra pixels in the back of his head, giving his hair almost the appearance of like a mullet. Oddly enough, this is the only scan with this detail, and it's missing from all the other screenshots, meaning this must have been abandoned pretty fast. Here we finally get to see a sprite of Link not attacking, and peculiarly enough, he seems to not have a shield. Also weirdly enough is, instead of a level and a number, the dungeon is named with its proper name, the Moon. And it seemingly is a lot bigger than the final, as well as using squares rather than rectangles. The blocks have a different sprite as well, and, well, there's still no bomb counter. I really don't have a good way to segue to this, because I'm bad at being a YouTuber, but in the same issue they focused a little bit on item sprites, so I guess I'll show you a few of the item sprites alongside what their final versions are. Issue 8 would come around, and it would have an emphasis on enemy sprites this time rather than items. This build seems a lot closer to the final, but still not quite there. Link's sprite was finalized, as well as finally adding the bomb counter. The font used in the FDS was nearly there, and the inventory screen was a lot closer to the final, and overall you could see it just lurching closer to the final. As said before, this issue put emphasis on the enemies and showcased their sprites, many of which are rather different from the final. You can take a look at them right here. Stepping aside from Famimaga issues, we get one final look at the pre-release in an FDS promotional video. Overall, this build isn't too dissimilar to the one in issue number 8, but a few things are still worth going over. The old man who gives you the sword in this version gives you the option to choose between a sword or a boomerang, and his text reflects this by saying, "It's dangerous to go alone, take whichever you prefer." The dungeons and some parts of the overworld have tweaks, but the biggest difference is with the shops. The potion shop in particular featured a blue potion for 20 rupees and a red potion for 50 rupees. I assume they changed this for game balance as to not to make the red potion useless, as in this version, 2 blue potions is 40 rupees, still cheaper than the red potion. The other shop that we get to see in the video is a standard one carrying a combination of the magical shield, candle, and bombs at 120, 60, and 30 rupees. This combination is never actually seen in the final game, and the prices of bombs and shield are also slightly different. That's the last we get from the promo video or Famimaga, but we do have one last build of the game that we know of, a prototype disc dated to 1985, December 28th, roughly 2 months before the final released. Much of the game at this point had been finalized, and only a few things were left undone, were the second quest and some bug fixes. Still, there are some interesting pieces here and there. The tables for enemy drops were different, and it seemed like the game was originally going to drop a lot more blue rupees, something that I certainly would have appreciated, but most likely was done to make the game harder. Tangentially related to the drop tables is the fact that the Dodongos would no longer immediately drop bombs in the prototype upon their death, as this wasn't hard-coded in just yet. The shops had different items and prices. Most notably, they lowered the price of the monster bait and the bombs, probably to make the game just a little bit less grindy, as in the final game, enemies didn't drop blue rupees like they were Tic Tacs. The gambling minigame was a little bit nicer in the prototype. It would be made a little bit riskier in the final version, as the rewards tables were adjusted. Some of the enemy sprites were different as well. The Stalfos' foot was redrawn, as well as the skull slightly readjusted. Fun fact, this sprite is actually still present in the manual's picture. The Wallmaster was missing its spots. Pole's voice was missing their whiskers, which is odd because they're in the manual art. Ganon turned gray instead of brown when ready to be hit by the silver arrow, and there's a slightly more detailed version of the boulder which was never used. And finally, the Guineas have a split leg design, which makes them look like a pissed off starfish rather than actually a ghost. Oddly enough, this actually fits the manual art better than the in-game sprite currently. Overall, I just barely scratched the surface of the history of this game, and I'm certainly not the person to be talking about when it comes to some of the more technical aspects. If you'd like to know more, I have a bunch of resources in the description below that I used to make this. Thank you for watching, and once again, goodbye.